by Meg Barnhouse. We gather to worship, our hearts alive with hope, that here we will truly see, that here we will be welcomed into the garden of this community, where the simple, the elegant, the fluted and frilled, the shy and the dramatic complement each other and are treasured. May we know that here each contributes in their way to the beauty of the whole. Come, let us worship together, all generations, sexualities, colors, politics, clappers and non-clappers, progressive or conservative. May we root ourselves in the values of this faith, compassion and courage, transcendence, justice, and transformation. Mary will light the chalice here in the sanctuary. I invite you to light your own chalice and place it where it can be seen by all of us if you are able. We gather this hour as people of faith with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope as a sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together. Before we sing the first hymn, let me remind you to leave yourselves muted. However, we want you and whoever is with you to sing with Jan and Mary as big and loud as you like. Make it a joyous experience. So let us all sing the opening hymn. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, number 97.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long way from home. A long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I have no friend. Sometimes I feel like I have no friend. Sometimes I feel like I have no friend. A long way from home. A long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. A long way from home. A long way from home.
Thank you. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist community of Cambria. We are glad you have joined us today. As a Unitarian Universalist community, we celebrate religious diversity and welcome all who journey in search of faith and spirituality. The UUCC is a lay-led congregation inviting speakers from different religious traditions and spiritual or scientific backgrounds to speak at our pulpit. We encourage presentations covering a variety of topics and areas of interest to our community that connect us with the UU7 principles. Today's service centers around the sixth principle. We affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. As naive or as impossible as the sixth principle may seem, we should not give up on it. In the face of our culture's apathy and fear, we should imagine and help create a powerful vision of peace by peaceful means, liberty by liberatory means, and justice by just means. We should believe and live as if we believe that a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all is possible. There is no guarantee that we will succeed, but we will improve ourselves and improve the world by trying. My name is Catherine Lekich, and I am your worship associate this morning. I would like to extend a special welcome to today's guests and visitors. We're glad you've joined us this morning under these challenging circumstances. If you are a guest and would like to introduce yourself, please raise your Zoom hand and unmute yourself when Susan calls your name.
It looks like we're all UU family here.
Mhm.
Back to you, Kat.
Great. If you are not on our mailing list, please visit our website at www.uucambria.org so that we can keep you informed about all of our activities. And please check out what's happening, a weekly e-blast sent to all of our members and friends. This is a great way to keep up with the latest news in our community. And as a reminder, if you wish to see this or any of our past Zoom services again, recordings of these activities can be found on the UU website and Facebook as well. The membership committee invites non-members to consider joining our community. Please contact Janet Cooper or a person on the board if you are interested. Thank you. So again, good morning and welcome to everyone. Let us now recite the affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help one another. We set aside this time for any short announcements that would be of interest to our UU community members and friends. Please keep your items short and to the point. For any items that need more explanation, please call or email the person after the service to be respectful of everyone's time. If you have an announcement, please raise your Zoom hand by clicking Raise Hand button in the reactions icon. When Susan calls your name, please unmute yourself, then speak.
Do we have any announcements from the sanctuary?
Yes, this is Jan. I have two announcements. One, several people commented on the offering music last week, and it was Simple Gifts. And I feel terrible that I didn't attribute the beautiful arrangement to Jay Althouse. It was really, he did a great job. My second announcement is the worship committee has decided to do an extravaganza on July 4th, similar to what we did at Christmas for our holiday potpourri. So we're asking all of you to collect your thoughts, first of all, and come up with some patriotic or remembrance of something that happened to you or happened to the world or whatever on July 4th of any year, preferably that you remember. So we want songs, poems, cupcakes, sparklers, whatever you do. Please let me or someone on the worship committee know so we can compile our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy, did you have an announcement?
Yes, thank you, Susan. The Moving Towards Racial Justice group is meeting this Wednesday at 7. There's a Zoom link in the email that goes out with the announcements, the newsletter. Thank you. Those technical terms, just anyways. So we're talking this Wednesday about our personal journeys to realizing we have white privilege and how that's affected us. or how white privilege affects us. And I think that's it. Oh, there's nothing to read. Just show up. Thank you. Everyone's welcome.
Thank you. Randy, did you have any announcements? No? Okay, Joel? I don't know if it's you or who it is, but yes. Please unmute yourself and make your announcement.
The May potluck is coming up Tuesday, 4 p.m. at my house. It's 4 p.m. because it's hors d'oeuvres and drinks. So bring hors d'oeuvres. We're discouraging shared casseroles and dips. And this is for vaccinated members. So it's coming up Tuesday, day after tomorrow, 4 p.m. at my house, 4714 Windsor Boulevard. For more information, contact me or Jenna Cooper or Marcia Nathanson.
Thank you, Joel. And it looks like that's it. So back to you, Kat.
Next week, Everett Thompson, the chairperson of the UUA Side with Love campaign and co-producer of the Valentine Day service, will present What's Love Got to Do with It? Side with Love and the Eighth Principle. Sharing together some of our personal and significant joys and concerns brings us closer as a faith community. We invite you to share the milestones that are deeply felt as a part of your personal life. But please be mindful and considerate of all who come to worship with us this morning. This is a time of community building. The collective flames of these candles embody all the joys and sorrows which may have gone unspoken today, but are also deeply felt in this community. The first reading. Social activist Julia Ward Howe first brought the idea of Mother's Day to the United States after the Civil War. But Howe's version was much different from the flowers and hugs version we know today. Howe wrote the Mother's Day Proclamation and envisioned a Mother's Day for peace in which women would protest against war. Some groups still observe the holiday in this manner, one of the most famous being a huge crowd of women who gathered outside the Lawrence Livermore Library at the University of California in 1982 to protest nuclear weapons. Julia Ward Howe, who is the poet who wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic, wrote this proclamation: Arise, all women who have hearts, whether your baptism be that of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure others. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence indicate possession. In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a General Congress of Women without limit of nationality may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient and at the earliest period consistent with its objects, to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace. Let us enter a place of peace and serenity where you are one with your spiritual being. Be at peace within your space where the absence of all that is temporal is its most cherished gift. Let us enter the stillness. Please come back now. The second reading, an excerpt from What is Owed. If true justice and equality are ever to be achieved in the United States, the country must finally take seriously what it owes Black Americans, by Nicole Hannah-Jones, published in the New York Times, June 30th, 2020. Most Americans are in an almost pathological denial about the depth of the Black financial struggle. That 2019 Yale University study called The Misperception of Racial Economic Equality found that Americans believe that Black households hold $90 in wealth for every $100 held by white households. The actual amount is $10. About 97% of study participants overestimated Black-white wealth equality, and most assumed that highly educated, high-income Black households were the most likely to achieve economic parity with white counterparts. That is also wrong. The magnitude of the wealth gap only widens as Black people earn more income. Quote, "These data suggest that Americans are largely unaware of the striking persistence of racial economic inequality in the United States." The study's, end quote, the study's authors write. Americans, they write, tend to explain away or justify persistent racial inequality by ignoring the tailwinds that have contributed to their economic success, while justifying inequalities of wealth and poverty by invoking the role of individuals' traits and skills as explanations for these disparities. They use the exceptional examples of very successful Black people to prove that systemic racism does not hold Black Americans back, and point to the large numbers of impoverished Black people as evidence that Black people are largely responsible for their own struggles. The anthem today is March, March by the Chicks.
It's a good slideshow, but we can't hear anything.
Sorry about that. If you're interested in seeing it, and it is a wonderful video, you can Google March, March by the Chicks. If anybody has any problems doing that, I'd be happy to send you the link if it's easier for you that way. Today's sermon is entitled, Is Anything Owed? An American Black History Summary to be delivered by Nancy Tolan. The sermon covers the following principles: the inherent worth and dignity of every person, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Nancy Tolan joined this fellowship a year and a half ago. She was a member of the Fresno UU Church for more than 20 years before that. Early in her career, Nancy worked as a lawyer at Legal Services and then at the Central Valley Regional Center for the Developmentally Disabled. After a hiatus, she began practicing workers' compensation law in 2010. Nancy is married to Robert Wilkinson, and they have 2 grown children. Nancy and I starting our Moving Towards Racial Justice group last year. Nancy.
Thank you, Kat. Good morning, everyone, and happy Mother's Day. Sorry you couldn't hear the video. It's a great song. History was one of my least favorite subjects in school, although I have learned to appreciate it in the many years since I last sat in a history class. Perhaps I was bored because of the memorization of general events, corresponding dates, and some associated names. It did not paint a picture of what life was really like, nor was there any discussion of how that history influenced our lives today. Today, I'll be talking about some of the history I never learned in school and how it affects us today. More specifically, I'll be talking about the wealth gap between Black and white Americans and some of the historical causes of this disparity. Wealth is different from income. It is the reserves, the savings. It is what you use to make a down payment on a home or pay college expenses. Wealth is what we draw upon when there's a crisis, or what we can fall back on if we make a risky career change. The largest source of wealth is inheritance. Another major contributor to wealth is home equity. Why should we talk about this? What does it have to do with justice, equity, and compassion? There is a movement calling for reparations. In mid-April, yes, last month, the U.S. House Judiciary Committee passed a resolution which recommends creating a panel to consider reparations for slavery. The bill is far from law. It only passed a committee, and it still has to pass the full House and then the Senate. It is not my goal to convince you that reparations should be paid. I understand that there are many unanswered questions about the specifics of what reparations would look like. I am just looking at the history of government discrimination that I have only recently learned, as well as some extremely common misperceptions about wealth in this country. The source of my information is largely gleaned from a much more comprehensive New York Times article written by Nicole Hannah-Jones, published June 30th, 2020. There's also information from a documentary called 13th, which airs on Netflix, and some additional research I've done. 13th refers to the 13th Amendment, and we'll get to that. To start, we all studied the Mayflower, bringing the Pilgrims to Plymouth Rock. I learned about a guy named Miles Standish, funny clothes and a distinctive hat with a big buckle we'd make out of construction paper before Thanksgiving. You know, that holiday where we celebrate the Indians and Pilgrims sharing a meal. Well, at least that's what I was taught. The Pilgrims fled religious persecution and bravely decided to sail to the New World so they could practice their religion. The Mayflower came ashore at Plymouth in December 1620. But did you ever learn about the English ship, the White Lion, which in August 1619 brought enslaved Africans to Virginia, a full year before the Mayflower landed? Unlike the Pilgrims, these Africans did not choose to flee their homeland in search of a freer life. It seems to me that the start of slavery and what became America is just as vital a piece of the American history as the Mayflower. Why? Because this country and a large part of the basis of our economy was built on the unpaid work of the enslaved Africans. These Blacks toiled in both the North and South for 243 years until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. And not to split hairs, but many were freed before then and many were freed afterwards. Slavery was legal in all of the 13 original states when the United States was formed. Between the Revolutionary War and the start of the Civil War, the number of enslaved people grew fivefold to approximately 4 million. The enslaved Blacks worked the land, enriching not only the property owners, but also supporting many industries that resulted from those crops. For instance, cotton production fueled a textile manufacturing industry primarily in the northern states and bolstered the trade industry. Any economist will tell you that one manufacturing job creates 2 service jobs, as those factory workers need to eat, someplace to live, send their children to school, etc. The South also produced tobacco, sugar, rice, and more. The North benefited as slavery provided the raw products they turned into finished goods. In addition to working in the fields, enslaved people were the ones who built many of the buildings, worked the docks, were household servants and nannies, and the list goes on. Generally, they did the dirty work that years later, the freshest batch of immigrants did. Overall, the nation's prosperity benefited all its free citizens. And what was the economic value of slavery in the United States? At the time of the Civil War, there were approximately 4 million enslaved Blacks. The value of enslaved people held as property added up to more than all the railroads and factories combined. And yet those enslaved people received none of this wealth, and they were the property. Recent studies have calculated the financial benefit of slavery to the United States, and those estimates start at a low of $1 trillion. Now, trillion with a T. In short, enslaved Africans provided a great benefit to the US economy as it developed from a growing colony into a new nation. What did the enslaved people get from that work? Is it an exaggeration to say nothing? Money that enslaved people earned as musicians and craftspersons belonged to their enslavers, although some were allowed to keep some of these earnings on an individual basis. The enslaved people were not allowed to own property. Next, emancipation. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was made in 1862. What did that mean in practical terms? Assuming a person was freed, what did they have? Literally, the clothes on their back and a few personal goods. They had no money, no savings, no land to work, no home of their own. They had little, if any, education, and most could not read or write. They did not own horses or mules for transportation or to help work land. It is hard to imagine the practical situation in which freed people found themselves, and it certainly isn't something I learned about in school. There followed, and interestingly, reparations were paid. Specifically, in Washington, D.C., $300 was paid for each person freed by emancipation. But that money was paid to the enslaver as compensation for their lost property. There was no payment whatsoever to those enslaved for their decades of labor. There followed a brief period of Reconstruction lasting approximately 12 years that provided a limited number of benefits to the newly freed slaves, but that was short-lived. For instance, some land was seized to provide freed Blacks 50 acres and a mule, but that promise was revoked by the new President Andrew Johnson when Lincoln was assassinated, so that didn't last long. The South was devastated not only by the war itself, but also by the sudden loss of its free labor source. What to do? Almost immediately and for the next 100 years, several groups of laws and policies were implemented which helped to keep Black people out of the nation's economic growth. The first group of laws aimed at incarcerating Blacks in order to obtain free labor. Second, the Jim Crow laws physically separated Blacks. Third, there was a large group of laws and policies that effectively excluded most Blacks while appearing to be non-discriminatory. I'll briefly address each category. Netflix airs a fascinating documentary called 13th that I highly recommend watching. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution ended slavery, but it also allowed involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. The film traces the perpetuation of slavery through criminalizing mostly benign behavior, which enabled the police to arrest poor Blacks and force them to work for the state under convict leasing. States lost little time in enacting vagrancy laws and criminalizing minor offenses throughout the South. For example, in 1865, Mississippi enacted a law requiring Black people each January to have written evidence of employment for the coming year. If they did not have a job contract, they could be arrested. If they left a job before the end of the contract, they could be arrested and be forced to pay back the wages. In South Carolina, a law prohibited Black people from holding any occupation other than farmer or servant unless they paid an annual tax ranging from $10 to $100. There are also anti-enticement measures that designed to punish anyone who offered higher wages to a Black laborer under contract. Apprenticeship laws forced many miners into unpaid labor for white planters. This affected orphans or those whose parents were deemed unable to support them. Those initial laws were eventually struck down, but new methods of control emerged. Think Richard Nixon and the war on drugs, stop and frisk policies, harsher sentences for crack versus cocaine, and much more. The next group are the Jim Crow laws, which emerged forcing a physical separation. I always thought they were limited to separate entrances and drinking fountains, but they were much more insidious. The impact of Jim Crow laws was to keep Black people out of the economic system, denying them jobs, housing, education, and much more. One example is that public schools were segregated, but I didn't realize that many counties only provided a high school for white students. That means some entire counties had absolutely no high school whatsoever for Black children. In 1896, the US Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of separate facilities for whites and others, establishing the familiar separate but equal doctrine. The next group of laws and policies appear race neutral on their face, but they were racist in their effect. They are racist in their effect. These laws and policies are also at the heart of this country's current wealth. Here are but a few examples. The Homestead Act of 1862. From 1863 to 1934, the government gave away 246 million acres in 160-acre parcels to approximately 1.5 million white families, many of them European immigrants. That land represents nearly 10% of this country's land, and today, nearly 20% of all Americans are descendants of those land recipients. The Homestead Act does not exclude Black people specifically, but rather excludes two occupations, agricultural workers and domestic servants. So think about that. On the exact same day that emancipation frees the former slaves, enslaved people, the Homestead Act takes effect. 4 million are homeless, and the government starts to give away millions of acres to be ranched and farmed, but effectively precludes those who worked the land. Instead, appeals were made to white European immigrants to come. Next we come, and that's not to say anything about where they got that land, but this is not a talk about the Native Americans. New Deal programs is the next category of race-neutral but very effective legislation. The Social Security Act of 1935 excluded from coverage about half the workers in the American economy. Among the excluded groups were agricultural and domestic workers, a large percentage of whom were African American. Likewise, minimum wage provisions in the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 did not apply to domestic help, seasonal, or agricultural workers. And one of the most important is the Federal Housing Administration and redlining. The federal government did not out and out exclude Black people from getting home loans. Rather, the government authorized the Homeowners Loan Corporation to determine which areas were safe investments. The Homeowners Loan Corporation gathered reams of local data to draw up residential safety maps of cities across the nation. Neighborhoods were classified into one of 4 categories based on favorable and detrimental influences. Factors included, quote, threat of infiltration of foreign-born, Negro, or lower grade population. A areas in green were considered the best. B in blue, good, but not quite as good. C areas in yellow were considered in decline. And finally, the D areas in red, hence the name redlining, were considered to be in full decline and unsuitable for lending. Not surprising, the classification method was heavily influenced by a neighborhood's racial and economic demographics. Redlined areas could not be insured. Without insurance, the FHA does not loan money. The neighborhoods redlined were neighborhoods where mostly the Black and brown people lived. The result was that 98% of all FHA loans went to white families. That's from 1934 to 1962. One reason this is particularly egregious is that so much of the American wealth grew out of the homes bought during those years. Veterans benefits is the next group of racially neutral but discriminatory legislation. So during World War II, more than 1 million Black Americans served in uniform. Nearly half of the 16 million World War II vets used the education or vocational training, but if a veteran vocational program was taught at a segregated school, Blacks could not attend. We also talked about the lack of high schools and for many Blacks. College admission programs did not necessarily accept Blacks, and many did not have a high school education. Anyways. In 1955, nearly a third of all home loans were vet loans. While the GI's bill language did not specifically exclude African Americans from its benefits, it was structured in a way that ultimately shut the door on Black veterans. First, the program was administered by individual states instead of the federal government. Mortgage loans were not administered by the VA itself, but only co-signed, leaving white-run financial institutions free to refuse mortgages and loans to Black people. Redlining made buying a home impossible to buy in poorer neighborhoods. Many suburbs used restrictive housing covenants to exclude Blacks. How many of us grew up in a home purchased with an FHA or VA loan? I know I did, and boy, did that house appreciate over the decades. There are many laws that had similar race-neutral language, but extremely racist application. It must also be said that there was plenty of private discrimination that excluded Blacks, such as labor unions that did not allow Blacks and other minorities. Again, I'm just focusing on government discrimination. Moving up to the 1960s, the civil rights legislation outlawed discrimination in a series of laws. For example, in 1968, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which outlawed housing discrimination on the basis of race, gender, religion, and other categories. But with a bit of reflection, we realize that changing the law doesn't necessarily change the practice. Lawsuits and lawyers are often needed to enforce the law. As recently as 1993, 25 years after enactment of the Fair Housing Act, a federal lawsuit was needed in Vidor, Texas, in order to integrate public housing there. Soon afterwards, though, the few Black people that did move into the housing were driven out by white supremacists. Recent statistics show the population of Vidor, Texas as 91% white and less than 0.5% Black. I think most of us remember the fight to integrate schools, and this is another example of lawsuits needed to force integration and busing. Nicole Hannah-Jones argues that wealth, or really the lack of wealth, is the defining feature of Black life in America since slavery ended. Wealth, the assets and investments minus debt, is the basis for getting and staying ahead in this country. Despite all the legislation of the 1960s and the general lack of conscious racism, the wealth gap today looks the same as it did in the 1950s. Today, the typical Black household is poorer than 80% of white households. A recent study found, quote, "No progress has been made over the past 70 years in reducing income and wealth inequalities between Black and white households." As you can see from the slide, the white family's median net worth is represented by the top lime green line. Black and Latinx families' lines run almost together along the bottom. The economic statistics are full of evidence of the wealth gap between Blacks and whites, yet whites are largely unaware of this fact, as we heard in the reading. Before COVID, Black households held $10 in wealth for every 100 held by white households. The disparity is greater now. There are a number of common misperceptions about the causes of the racial wealth gap, but data and social science research show that the beliefs are wrong. I'd be embarrassed to admit how many of these I believed were factors. First, the wealth gap is not about poverty. Poor white families earning less than $27,000 a year hold nearly the same amount of wealth as Black families earning 2 to 3 times that much. The wealth gap is not about poor spending habits. Studies show that Black Americans save at a slightly higher rate than white Americans with similar incomes. The wealth gap is not due to value placed on education. Controlling for various factors so that apples are compared to apples, Black parents provide more support for their children's college education than white parents do. Also, studies show that Black teens are actually more likely to go to college than similarly situated white youth. One of the most astounding facts is that college does not pay off for Black Americans the way it does for other groups. A Black college graduate is about as likely to be unemployed as white Americans with a high school diploma. It should come as no surprise that a Black college graduate holds less wealth than white Americans who dropped out of high school. The wealth gap is not simply a lack of home ownership. Although it is true that Black Americans have the lowest rates of home ownership in the nation, studies show that Blacks have to pay higher mortgage rates with equal creditworthiness. And additionally, homes in Black neighborhoods do not appreciate as much as those in white areas. A Duke University study notes that the ability to buy a home in the first place is seldom just the result of hard work and frugality, but rather parental and grandparental wealth is a major component in the purchase of a home. That means that white families who benefited from buying homes in the 40s and 50s due to FHA and veteran loans have a large head start in accumulating wealth. Finally, the wealth gap is not due to single Black parents. The typical white single parent has twice the wealth of the typical 2-parent Black family. Almost done here. To paraphrase Hannah-Jones, wealth begets wealth, and white Americans have had centuries of government assistance to accumulate wealth, while the government has worked effectively against Black Americans doing the same. Economists Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity conclude that inheritances and other intergenerational transfers, quote, account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic and socioeconomic indicator. So, as you try to live by the UU principles of compassion, justice, and equity, please consider this history as you ponder the issue of reparations and ask yourself, is anything owed?
Nancy, thank you for that. Normally at this time, we receive offerings from our congregants. However, due to the virtual format of this service, we invite you to make your offering in one of the methods shown on the slideshow. These methods are posted in the newsletter and on the UUCC website. Please keep in mind that our congregation is entirely self-governed by the democratic process. One of the privileges of our free church tradition is to provide all of the financial support for our many ministries from among ourselves. Generosity, therefore, is one of the spiritual values we recognize as central to our personal and our institutional well-being. You are invited to participate in the blessing of giving by sending us an offering. Thank you. Our thanks for all gifts given and received for the work of this community. Now let us sing the doxology.
From all that dwell below the skies, let faith and hope with love arise. Let beauty, truth, and good be sung through every land, by every tongue.
Please join in singing the closing hymn, There's a River Flowing in My Soul, number 1007.
There's a river flowing in my soul. There's a river flowing in my soul. And it's telling me
Now let us recite the valediction. We extinguish the flame of this chalice, and we know that the light of truth and love and the warmth of this community go with us until we meet again. Please extinguish your chalice at home now. After the benediction, please click on the gallery view button in the upper right corner of your screen, but please remain muted. Susan will call on you when you raise your Zoom hand. Nancy.
Thanks again, Kat. As you march out into that unmasked world, seeing friends, family, and complete strangers, may you have safe passage.